Welcome to Story Collider.
Yeah! Awesome. I'm Miriam.
Nice. I'm Shane.
And we are the Story Collider producers for this special show. Yeah!
We will be your hosts for the evening.
We shall be, guiding you through the wonderful world of science-inspired stories. So by a round of applause, how many of you are here at Story Collider for the first time? Nice.
All right.
Somebody raised their hand. You've been at a meeting too long.
It's been a long week. So we mentioned the meeting. So this is AGU. How many of you are here from AGU? Okay. So not everyone. So you're probably wondering, like, what the heck is AGU? So for the uninitiated, as it were, this show is a special show. It's not part of our regular series here in DC. This is in partnership with the American Geophysical Union. This is my day job. So we're a giant science society, 60,000 plus members, 139 countries around the world. And this week is our thing. This is fall meeting. It's a week of 29,000 scientists are here in DC right now as part of... No, they said 9.
Fight! No.
It's a big deal. So this show is in conjunction with them. So all the storytellers you're going to see tonight are part of the meeting. Scientists, science journalists, whatever that might be.
So do you want to tell them what they've gotten themselves into by coming to this evening Story Collider extravaganza?
Yeah, so these are true personal stories about science. These are not science lectures. This is not a TED Talk. This is not a keynote. Whatever you've seen at the meeting, this is not what that's going to be.
Put your laser pointers down. Yeah.
No. There's we have a saying at Story Collider that there's no learning at Story Collider. So put that away.
Yeah, you are done learning for the day. Tonight is all about feelings and emotions and the true stories that our storytellers are here to regale you with tonight. And
what's your experience with, like, your science background?
My science background. So I was actually thinking as we were working with our storytellers for tonight about how I could have been, in an alternate universe, a geoscientist myself. Because in the 3rd grade, all of the cool kids were members of the rock club. It is very true. And so it was hosted by Lindsay L., not Lohan, but I will spare you her last name because of privacy and whatnot. And she was so cool, and she would invite all the cool kids over every Saturday so that they could trade rocks. She had a cool rock tumbler so you could shine up your rocks. Very cool stuff. And so I was preparing in my 3rd grade career to put in my application to join this rock club. And so whenever I was really, really good, my dad would take me to this store called Zany Brainy that had all of these fun, nerdy things.
No.
Yes.
Zany Brainy had nerdy
things. And I would go and I would purchase a rock after spending 30 to 45 minutes sifting through them, trying to find my perfect treasure. And finally, I decided that my rock collection was up to snuff. And so I go up to Lindsay at recess, and I'm like, check out these rocks. Can I be a member? And she consorted with her colleagues and said, sure. I'll have my mom call your mom, and we'll set something up for Saturday.
How old were you?
I was in 3rd grade. I don't know. 8? Thank you. I was 8 years old, smooth 8. And then she gave me this little pebble that was supposed to be my membership card. And so Saturday rolls around, and my mom drops me off at her house, and I walk up the stairs, and I knock on the door, and she comes and answers, and I'm like, here's my little rock. And she laughs at me and says that, that's just a fake rock membership thing, and closes the door on my face.
What?
And so I had to do that really devastating thing where you kind of sulk back to your mom, and I was just I must have gotten the date wrong. But because I had the enterprising spirit of a pre-Lemonade Beyonce, The next morning, I was like, I will start an animal club because my mom gives vaccines to all of the zookeepers, and we get into the Bronx Zoo for free.
Ooh.
Yeah, it was not a very popular club because I was not a very popular person, but I did become a biologist all these years later. She turned out okay.
So I'm a biologist also by training, and when I was making this transition from the research world into more of the SciComm science policy world, I was looking for jobs, as one does, and I heard about a job through a friend of a friend at this place called American Geophysical Union.
The what now?
I know, right? Like I had never heard of this thing. No, and their sharing science program. I was like, I like to share science, so I applied and I interviewed and I got it, and here I am. But I'd say so this was like early September. My third day, I really think it was the third day, I'm in this meeting with my boss and my boss's boss, and we're just chatting, normal stuff, and then they say to me, and paraphrasing because they're here.
We won't tell.
Yeah, so we don't want to alarm you, but my boss and her partner are having a child at the end of November, about 2 weeks probably before fall meeting. And I was cool, I was calm, I was collected, because one, I didn't know what the hell fall meeting was, and two, like I can do anything, right? This is be fine. But I walked out of there and I was freaking out because I started talking to my new colleagues about this. Like, oh, really? You're going to be on your own, like just you, just doing this for fall meeting? Like it's going to be just you? It's going to be terrible. You'll be fine. And I freaked out. Like for 2 weeks, I really did. I freaked out because it did happen. I got a text one morning, like right before Thanksgiving, like, hey, it's happening. We'll talk. This is my boss's boss. We'll talk on Monday. And so I kept it together, and those 2 weeks just kind of flew by. And we got to the meeting, and it was fine. It really was. It was like, it ended up working out just okay. My new colleagues, like they were so supportive, and I made new friends and peers, and it turns out like I wasn't alone by any means. But I'll never forget my first fall meeting. And now 3 fall meetings later, this is my 4th one, I could not be happier to be here, and I am so very happy that all of you are here tonight. And so, yes, that's what this is, right?
This is Shane's 4th anniversary
party. This is
party.
my 4th anniversary. More like 3rd, but we'll go with that.
Well, okay, I can't count this.
But anyways, so without further ado, you're not here to listen to us. Our names were not on the thing.
So are you all ready for your first storyteller of the night? Yeah. So she is a volcanologist who travels the world watching things explode. Yeah, it's awesome. So please give a warm round of applause to Janine Krippner.
First of all, to everyone here, I'd like to submit a personal invitation for you to join my rock club. And my rocks explode into the atmosphere. It's way cooler than any rock club you've ever been rejected from. Let me know if you want to join in later. So when I was 13 years old, I knew that I was going to be a volcanologist and get a PhD. I'd been obsessed with volcanoes since I was a little girl, and I finally knew that this was actually a career option. So 2 decades later, I finally reached this goal. I got my PhD. You'd think that I'd be filled with relief and pride, but I was focused on what the heck am I going to do now? Being a non-US citizen, being a Kiwi, in the US, I was faced with the need to get a job or leave the country and my life here behind, and I really didn't want to leave you guys. So I had my priorities straight. Get a job now or leave the country and my life here behind. I had no idea that life did not care about my priorities at the time. On the other side of the planet, a very powerful set of events had already begun unfolding. On the 20th of September 2017, a volcano in Bali, Indonesia, entered my life. Agung volcano had just been raised to alert level 3 out of 4, the second highest alert level. Now, with 40 volcanoes-ish around the world erupting on any given day, this in itself is no big deal, but the location was. Having been to Bali, I knew that this is an island that relies on international tourism. It is an Instagrammer's dream. I sent out a tweet on Twitter about the alert level increase, as I had so many times before with so many different volcanoes. This was really nothing special. I'd been on Twitter since 2013 and nothing I'd done had been really important, so this was just another thing I was doing. I had no idea what was about to happen. On the 22nd, AGU volcano was raised to alert level 4 out of 4, the highest alert level. This meant that there's an elevated chance of AGU producing an eruption. And looking at how fast the activity had ramped up within a week, it looked like this could happen very soon. This was bad news. This really caught my attention. I started investigating the situation and reading the official Indonesian reports on the volcano, using Google Translate because I do not speak Indonesian. I did not see my imminent life derailment occurring as I read. At 11:45 p.m. on the 22nd, I got a message from a friend of mine in Bali. Is the volcano in Bali about to explode? I'm in Bali now. I'd rather rely on a good source of information than random mates on Facebook. I'm weird like that. I've just been told that there's an imminent alert of eruption and flights are being cancelled. What the heck was going on? I had no idea where this was coming from. So from my home in Pittsburgh, I started investigating what information people actually had access to. I was very concerned with what I found. I had this bad feeling in my gut that got worse with every terrible headline I've read. You might have seen Yellowstone headlines around the world. It's really bad. I went cold with the realization of the potential situation that was unfolding right in front of me. AGU was a volcano that had killed 1,100 people in 1963, and it could do so again. So I started sending out tweets in English, just reporting the official information. As a volcanologist, there are certain rules that I play by. The official information must come from the Volcano Observatory. They're the only people that have all of the monitoring data. They're the only people that have all of the local knowledge about that volcano. It's very important that we do nothing to undermine that or to cause confusion. That's very dangerous. So all I did was work to support their message. I did so. I kept doing this, sending out tweets on Twitter. And then something happened. I didn't see it coming. The world noticed. The international media noticed. Within 2 weeks, my waking hours switched from day to night. I felt physically ill from the time change. It was like a long hangover without the party. I felt very nervous and very uncomfortable being called a world expert on this volcano that I had been to, but I knew nothing about until this time. But I felt like this was the right thing to do. Within those 2 weeks, the international media noticed, and what I was saying was being relayed to people around the world. People that needed help noticed, and my messages were being relayed on local tourism boards as well. Other scientists noticed, and something happened that I was very careful to not do. I was accused of making my own interpretations of the data. I was devastated. This went against everything that I knew that you don't do as a volcanologist. I couldn't believe this was happening. I went ice cold with this realization of what people thought I was doing. I had too many questions to defend myself at the time. Why didn't they just ask me? Why didn't they look at what I was doing? Everyone I asked said that there was no way that I was doing this, so why did these people think I was? It was a pretty scary time. So this was a defining moment for me. I made a choice to continue. I knew that at this point I was afraid that I'd damaged my career. And my career isn't just a job. I'm a volcanologist, but to me this is who I am. It always has been and it always will. So this was when I made a choice to continue. I decided that it was much more important to continue helping people than it was worrying about being kicked out of the country and ruining my career at that time. This was when the whirlwind of misinformation and the whirlwind that caught me and carried me through this crisis became this decision, and I moved forward. I was so afraid. I was looking at this information gap that had formed around this volcano. This gap was a pretty scary gap, and it's going to happen again one day, maybe. This gap forms because even though the local Indonesians did a great job getting out information, Bali is a tourism island, and that means at any one given point, a lot of the people on the island are not from there. It means they do not speak the local language, and they don't know where to get the right information when there is a crisis like a volcanic eruption. So when a volcanic eruption is about to happen, perceived or not perceived, real or not, who is going to fill that gap? Well, at this point, we all know that in this time, it was me. So I had stepped in and I was tweeting out the official information in English. And when this first happened, it was a very insignificant moment because I'd been doing this over and over again. But it made a difference. So when this all started happening, it looked like something was going to happen really quickly. But 2 months went by with fear-mongering headlines and misinformation, with media screaming that a volcanic eruption was imminent, and nothing had happened. In late November, things changed again. Agung is erupting, were the words that I woke up to at 5:30 in the morning after a few hours sleep. Agung is erupting. My response was groaning, oh no. And then the adrenaline kicked in, and I raced out of bed, and I was throwing my clothes on as I raced downstairs to my laptop to try and get this information out. Agung was erupting. It was actually erupting. After 2 months of this taking up every second of my life and taking up international media's interest around the world, this volcano was actually erupting. It was showtime. I was focused. I was on high alert. I was nervous. I was really afraid that people were going to get hurt or killed and that I could have done something to prevent it. This volcano had killed people in the recent past, and it could do so again. People needed the right information. They needed to know what the hazards were, and they needed to know how to stay safe. This could have been really bad. But thank goodness, this time, it didn't. No one died. It was okay. So after all of this, with this volcanic eruption, this media disaster that happened, there have been a lot of lessons learned. I feared that this was going to ruin my career, and it was only recently that I realized it did not. In fact, it's completely changed my career and my life. I'm still in touch with people in Bali, and our lives are much different now. I'm here at AGU to discuss the lessons that I've learned and to build networks to fill this gap. I'm very afraid that this could happen again, and the next time we won't be so lucky. Thank you.
So there was a small park near my house when I was growing up. It had a playground, it had a baseball diamond, but if you wanted to find me and my buddy Nate, your best bet would actually be to look in the creek along the edge of the forest towards the end of the park. You'd find us wading in the water looking for special rocks, and these rocks were special to us because these rocks were full of fossils. Fossil shells in particular, and we could tell there was something weird about them because they looked sort of like the shells that you would see when you go to the beach, but there was something a little off about them. There was something just a little bit different. And as third graders, not members of a rock club, but just amongst ourselves, we knew that this required further study. So we would collect the best rocks that were available to us on this expedition, and we would get ready to head home. And if we went to Nathan's house, we'd probably get distracted playing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Hyperstone Heist on his Sega Genesis. But if we went to my house, where we didn't have any video games, we could use some of my fossil books to maybe identify these things that we found. There are two problems with this approach. The first problem is that fossil books for kids tend to focus on the big charismatic stuff, things like dinosaurs and mammoths, and less on Ordovician brachiopods, which is what we'd actually collected. And the second problem is a good number of the books I had been written by creationists. So by the time, So by the time I graduated from high school, everything I knew about evolution had come from the pulpit at church and not the lectern at school. And the funny thing is, I think about these dinosaur books now, and the ones that were the creationists from the church library, they actually kind of weren't bad. Like, the way they explained going out into the field and getting fossils is pretty much how we go out in the field and get fossils. And the way they reconstructed the dinosaurs is pretty much how we think those dinosaurs looked at that time. And it was really only when you asked how old the dinosaur was or any other interpretive aspect of paleontology that they would go off the rails and start talking about literal dragons and generally sowing doubt into the integrity of the scientific method. I went to a series of evangelical churches growing up, and each of them had pretty consistent views on the fact that evolution was bad and deceptive and evil, and creationism was good and pure and true. And even given this narrative, I was never mad about the science. I was never upset at science. I still loved science. I was fascinated by the natural world. I'd just been only given one way to interpret the world around me. And the funny thing is I went to a public school, and the public school really didn't have anything to say on the matter either. And I think about why that may have been. And I think there was a lot of certainty coming from the church. They knew for sure that they were right. And I think even my science teachers at the school were still part of that same sort of faith community in a small town, and were maybe not wanting to pick the fight with the church by saying what was coming out of the pulpit on Sunday was wrong. And I don't necessarily blame them for that, but it just meant that they weren't saying anything. And when science is taught to kids, it's often taught as just this series of facts, these things that we know about the world. And it's not taught as a process or a way that we understand the world and learn new things. That usually doesn't come until later in college or even grad school. And so what I had on one hand was absolute certainty coming from the church and silence with an accessory list of facts coming from the school and no sense that anything was amiss. And I think about that certainty a lot because certainty can be really rigid. If you are certain about something, there's no room to modify it. And without that modification, your certainty can become very brittle. And when something is brittle and it has a stress or a force applied to it, it doesn't deform to accommodate that new stress or new information, it just breaks. And sometimes it breaks catastrophically and falls apart entirely. And by the time I graduated high school, I was starting to develop some cracks in the foundation of my belief based on this kind of brittle certitude. And the first one I really remember happening was when my dad and I decided to go to an after-hours lecture by a creation scientist that was being hosted at the church. His talk focused on how we don't see change over time, which is a core tenet of evolution, and descent with modification doesn't create new lineages, and we don't see any transitional fossils in the fossil record, which is pretty typical stuff for a creationist lecture of this level. And during the Q&A portion, my dad had a question. My dad's a physician, and this was around the time that the antibiotic-resistant bacteria crisis was really coming to the forefront in medicine. So his question was a hypothetical case study where he raised his hand and said, let's say I have a patient who has a bacterial infection, and I want to treat that infection using an antibiotic. Let's say amoxicillin is the most appropriate one. So I prescribe a course of antibiotics, and I kill all the bacteria but one. One bacterium survives because it's resistant. And once that treatment is done, that bacteria is going to start to reproduce. And bacteria reproduce by splitting in half, and each of the two new daughter cells is a clone of the parent cell that produced them. And so this new colony, this new infection of bacteria is all going to be resistant to amoxicillin. And so if I've taken a population, applied a pressure, they've changed over a single generation into a population with a new trait, how does that jive with everything you've just said? I don't remember what the guy's answer was. It probably had something to do with the differences between micro and macro evolution, which is how creationists explain that we can have different breeds of dogs and horses, but how horses never become hippos. And this isn't the way that a person who studies evolution actually thinks about the topic, but that's probably the answer that he would have given. Instead of listening to the answer, I just remember being stunned by the fact that my dad, who's this devout believer, could completely wreck this guy's argument with one simple hypothetical, and he wasn't doing it to be mean-spirited. He had an honest question, and there wasn't a good answer. My dad and I never really discussed what had happened that evening. Our relationship at the time was strained in the way that a lot of relationships between fathers and sons get strained during adolescence. But it wasn't the only time I saw him undermine the church's doctrine, not through outright dissent, but through a carefully constructed and critical question that was just clever enough to completely undercut everything that they just said. And it taught me that I was allowed to use my natural curiosity to ask really pointed questions about the things I was being told to believe on faith alone. And so I graduated high school, and I headed off from a religious conservative upbringing in West By God, Virginia, to hippie liberal Santa Cruz, California. Go Slugs. I started off as a physics major because I'd had a good physics teacher in high school, and I imagine that's how a lot of us picked our first major, whether we stuck with it or not. And by the end of my first year at Santa Cruz, I was getting pretty burnt out on physics and calculus courses, but I had some time in my schedule where I could take a for fun class, whatever I wanted to take. And I found out that there was a course called The Natural History and Evolution of Dinosaurs. And it was then that I realized that my enthusiasm over the D word overcame my fear of the E word. The class was taught by Professor Hildy Schwartz, and it was in her class that I had the closest what I'll call road to Damascus moment in my conversion story. She was explaining the origin of dinosaurs in the Triassic and how they then evolved and diversified throughout the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. And she demonstrated this with a figure called a cladogram. And a cladogram is a special type of diagram that shows how organisms are related to one another based on traits that they have in common. And I was stunned. I was blown away by how complex, but ultimately how reasonable this explanation of dinosaurian diversity was. I'd been told my whole life that evolution claimed that things happened in these giant leaps and bounds, horns sprouting out of faces, hands turning into flippers, things like that. But here, I was seeing a much more subtle story. I was seeing how a shift in an ankle bone could change everything, or a new hole opening up in the skull might lead to a completely new lineage. And it took a lot of careful consideration. These people weren't just making assumptions and running off the cuff. They were really thinking about these things in order to put this all together correctly. It was like pieces of a puzzle that may make some sense on their own, but really it's only once you put them in the context of a larger whole can you really see the big picture. And it was then that I realized that this thing that I'd been told was going to lie to me my whole life, was going to try to deceive me, was instead really elegant and really clear and really open and really wanting to be understood. And it made a big impact on me to the point where my brittle belief really did start to break down. I remember that was the moment where this fire had been lit, because I realized that the things that we thought we knew could really be challenged, because we had this system here that instead of being rigid and firm was actually flexible and wanted to be tested, and that going out and finding a new fossil that might change the way you understand an organism isn't a bug but a feature. You want to actually go out and change everything you thought you might know by finding a new thing. And it was with that revelation that I realized I needed to reconsider everything that I knew too. So I was so passionate about this course for the rest of my time there that I even sat in the front row of lecture, which is kind of a big deal for someone like me. And later, after the class finished, I went up to Hildy and asked her if there were more classes I could take along this subject. And she didn't know my personal history. She didn't know why her class had been so profoundly revelatory for me. She just saw a really eager student who wanted to learn more, and she helped me get signed up for some advanced paleontology classes that were happening in the fall, even though I didn't necessarily have all the prerequisites I needed to take them in the first place. Not long after, I ended up working in a vertebrate paleontology lab on campus with another professor, and then I changed my major to ecology and evolutionary biology. The brittle beliefs from my childhood eventually did crumble and were replaced with a new understanding, one that was much better able to bob and weave with an ever-changing body of knowledge about the world. I now find myself a tireless advocate for how awesome evolution is. I don't know if you guys remember, but it was only a few years ago that we as a society were having a pretty heated debate about whether it was appropriate to teach children evolution in school or if we should instead teach the controversy. The world's sort of on fire right now, so that debate has been put a little bit on the back burner. But it's still something I'm really passionate about because of my personal history with this whole subject. And as the saying goes, there's no one more zealous than a convert. Thank you.
So the other day, I was getting ready, rushing around, going to work. It was Monday. It was my big day at work, and I went out to feed my chickens. And there was a hawk in the chicken coop. Not good for anyone. So in the process of getting rid of the hawk, some of my chickens got out. And I went to get them back in. I had already put food in there, so that wasn't going to get them back in. And there is a very careful process for herding chickens. If you go directly at the chicken, you will never catch the chicken, at least in my own experience. So I did my chicken herding process. I have my arms out. I'm walking towards them, not too slowly, not too quickly. They go in, but then there's the third chicken. She doesn't go in. She's around the side of the coop, so I go and I try my patient chicken thing, and then I get overwhelmed with impatience. I gotta go to work, so I want to grab the chicken. Did I tell you before it never works? It doesn't work. She hops the fence into my neighbor's yard, and it's a bramble there. So I go around, I'm trying to catch her, so I do what every modern person does. I get on my phone, I go to YouTube to try to find a video, how to catch a chicken. It's YouTube. There's a choice. I select the taking the coat hanger, making into a hook to grab the chicken's ankle. Why I thought this was gonna work. The guy in the video's in this yard, it's like this big. I have all these trees and branches. I'm sitting there with a hook and I'm thinking, you are a complete idiot. It's not gonna work. So I leave, I go to work, I'm driving to work, and I am mad at the chicken. I'm blaming her because doesn't she know how dangerous it is? Last year I had a bear eating my chickens in the coop. There's bobcats. I live in Boulder, Colorado, right next to the open space, and I am not kidding. Bobcats, coyotes, foxes, and so on. And then I realize this is your fault. You're blaming the chicken. Well, no, I don't realize this actually very quickly. This is the sad story, part of the story. I feel good about blaming the chicken until there's this dawning, brief moment where I'm thinking, you're blaming the chicken. This is probably really not very smart. So then I realized it's my fault. I didn't follow the process. I didn't follow the chicken herding process, and in the process I put her actually in some danger, and I felt bad about that. And as a scientist, we trust the process. We have a scientific method. All of us have, I live and die by a process. Just for example, I ran here from giving a talk at the meeting, talking about Yellowstone. We're mapping the groundwater that feeds all these iconic features like Old Faithful. It's totally awesome. And, of course, I have to find the right kind of data that see that. It's electromagnetic data. And, we have helicopters, and we gotta deal with the park and do this whole process of making sure we collect the right data, good data, make sure our models are working. They weren't for a while. Coming to this meeting, getting more information, getting input from people. So there's this whole process to come up with a really good result to help us solve the problem. So I'm kind of used to living my life like that. And about 12 years ago, I was elected General Secretary of AGU, which is the treasurer. I was also the supervisor of the executive director, which is pretty silly. And that was before I was president. And I went into this thinking, there's going to be some process by which, we govern. It seemed like it at first. I had been in the organization for a while. I was very close to the executive director. He was a mentor and a friend to me. But pretty quickly, well, not pretty quickly, it's just kind of like the chicken in the car. Slowly. In retrospect, it was quick, but it wasn't. I started to seeing, AGU is a great organization and has been for a long time. At the time, our publications, high impact factors, we had a very popular meeting, growing membership, dedicated, long-serving staff. There was lots of great things about AGU. At the same time, there were signs that AGU wasn't ready for the future. They were still using Lotus 123 for the budget, and WordPerfect 2.0. WordPerfect 2.0. This is only 10 years ago. Yeah, you get the picture, right? And there were other things too. Lots, there was decision making was all made at the top. The press people had to ask to buy a couple $100 camera. There was lots of staff complaints. There was just a lot of things that were going on that were showing this dichotomy between looking great and not looking great. So we in the leadership thought, well, we need to make some changes. So we went to talk to the executive director, who, as I said, was a mentor and a friend, said, hey, look, we need to do some things to prepare AGU for the future. His attitude, essentially, is what he said to us was, I've been running AGU fine. It's been for more than 35 years. It's been very successful. That was true. I can run it the same way for another 35 years. And I'm thinking, maybe not, I don't. But here's the problem. I had no idea what making AGU ready for the future was. I had no process. And I was part of a group, but I'm talking about my experience, so I'm not trying to take credit for everything, but I was certainly a huge part of making changes. So I felt like I was in this black tunnel, the kind where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I just knew I needed to do something, but I had no idea where to go, how long the tunnel was, how long I was going to be in the tunnel, were there branches, and there were scary noises. And seriously, there was the scary noises where stuff like something would happen. I think, what is that? What am I supposed to do? I have no way of doing anything. And it was really horrible. And, you know, my day job is a scientist, but this was a huge part of my responsibility because I was an officer. I was really responsible for how the organization ran. So this went on for a while. And a lot of things that happened during this time seemed super random. So I had a friend of a friend came to town who did management consulting, whatever that is. And I explained to them what's happening at AGU, and they say, well, I don't do that, but I have a friend who does nonprofit association management consulting. I'm like, okay, whatever that is. And she might be able to help you. So I talked to the president at the time, and I said, hey, I have this person, maybe they can help us. And he's like, he had been head of an organization. He goes, you know, sometimes these consultants can be useful. Let's just see it. I mean, I cannot tell you what an understatement that was. So I called Mary Beth, and I explained the situation. I really, you know, I just felt stupid. I didn't know what to call anything. I had no process. I had no names for anything. And she made me feel better pretty quickly because she said, she's like, oh, yeah, that situation. You know, long-serving exec, great organization, needs changing, yeah, been there, done that. And I'm like, oh, you know, dumbly, oh, we're not alone, okay. So the lights didn't go on in the tunnel, but the noises weren't so scary. And so we did hire her, and I mean, she radically helped us transform the organization. And a lot of people our AGU members don't know, which is great, because it means we just did this really big structural change. She talked to us about governance, strategic planning, roles and responsibilities. We found out as the council that we were supposed to take care of legal and, you know, reputational and financial parts of the union. We weren't doing that. We weren't doing our jobs at all. And in fact, when the council found out that that was its job, they were like, we're all scientists, we don't want to do that. So in this super radical move, they voted themselves out of existence. And happily. And that was to pave the way for the structure we have now, which is a science council where they all get to talk about science, and a board of directors, which does have scientists on it, but deal with all this stuff. And, you know, it went on and on. I mean, there was lots of stuff, and it was so hard because the people we were going against was somebody who was very close to and a mentor. And I went through this period of trying to convince him of, you know, how great this was going to be, this change. And, of course, he didn't want to change. I would like to say that I learned this lesson, but I still have to learn it over and over again. You can't convince people of things they don't want to hear or can't hear. You know, I still make that mistake. But in the end, I got a process. I had a goal. We had a picture. So I felt a lot better. But one of my friends, when I was telling her about this talk, said, but you had a process. You got more information. You asked for help. And I was like, yeah, it's like, you know, okay. But so I just really, you know, got to appreciate again the situation of trusting a process, and in the case where you don't have one, find one. So back to the chicken. I go home from the work. The chicken is not dead. She is pacing up and down along the fence, wanting to go back in with the flock. But this time, I was like, okay, I'm not making the same mistake as this morning. Chickens don't see very well at night, so it's easier to catch them. It's also easier to kill them, according to the foxes and the bears and things I've gotten in my chicken coop, for that reason. So anyway, I wait for my neighbor. If you have chickens, your neighbors are always involved for a long list of reasons. So I call my neighbor, Rob, ex-Army. I say, Rob, you gotta come over. I have another chicken operation. You notice the word another. He's been involved with several. So he's like, yes, ma'am. Comes over. We wait till dark. Wait a little too long, but it was okay. The chicken jumped in the tree to roost. So he climbed up together. They can't fly very high, so it's okay. So he grabs the chicken. So you can grab the chicken under this case. This is one of the cases you can grab a chicken and get them. She makes this unearthly, horrible squawk, but he hands her to me. She calms down. She's in the coop. Hopefully she's still in the coop. So what I learned from all of this is, you know, whether it be science, association management, or chicken herding. Trust the process.
Isn't this awesome? Yes. So I'm a Canadian, and my dad was a science teacher. So I grew up pretty much with the idea that the grass is green, the sky is blue, and climate is changing due to human activities. And then I moved to the States for grad school. I was unaware that there were people in the world who thought that basic radiative transfer and nonlinear fluid dynamics was a myth. I was also unaware that there were people in the world who did not drink. I was so unaware of these two facts that I married someone before I knew that he was both. You may ask, what do you talk about in graduate school? And the answer is you talk about a lot of things, but when you don't ever imagine that the other person you're talking to doesn't think climate change is real, why would it come up? And on his part, he had never met somebody who shared his faith who did think climate change is real. He grew up in Northern Virginia in the horse farm country. My husband is a really smart person. He was doing his PhD in applied linguistics when I met him. He was an endowed professor at the University of Notre Dame at age 27. He'd be in the gym playing basketball with the students, and they'd be like, well, what do you study? And he'd be like, I teach you. But we had been married a couple of months before it dawned on us that we were on opposite sides of the fence when it came to a changing climate. So here we were, married to each other. We loved each other. We would prefer to stay married to each other. And this is most important, we respected each other. I knew he was a very smart person. He did quantitative research. He understood data and statistics. And he knew that I wasn't one of those people that he'd always imagined, fudging the data for monetary gain. That I sincerely was doing what I was doing, not for the monetary gain, but because I was genuinely concerned and I wanted to make a difference in the world. So we started talking. We started doing the most uncomfortable thing in the world, which is talking to someone you love about something that you profoundly disagree with them on. And it wasn't a conversation that happened every day. But, once a week, twice a week, take a break for a couple of weeks, we waded through the questions he had, the objections he had. And I'm going to tell you something. I feel like I learned more from him than he learned from me. Because I had never spent any time talking to people who didn't think that climate change is real. I just imagined they were sort of over there, way distant, some other type of species. But here was someone who I knew, who was smart, who was curious, and he didn't think it was real. So we could talk about it, and I could kind of start to understand, well, what have you heard? What have you been told? What are your objections? And he'd never had a chance to look at the data either. So it wasn't a light bulb turning on one day. It was a slow, gradual process with inflection points. One of the inflection points was when we went to NASA's website and we downloaded the global temperature data. And he himself opened it up in Excel and fit a trend line to it. And he said at that point he had a choice. Is all of NASA who put men on the moon involved in a global hoax extending back decades, even centuries, or is the planet actually warming? And then you have to get into, well, how do we know that it's humans? Could it be the sun? We dug up the radiation data for the sun, and we looked at what the sun's been doing. Turns out its energy's been going down the last 40 years, not up. What about orbital cycles? We got into that too. According to orbital cycles, we should be heading into the next ice age, not getting warmer. We dug into El Nino and looked at how El Nino can't just spontaneously create heat. It can lose a little bit of heat out the top of the atmosphere, but all it does is rearrange the energy balance of the Earth's climate system. And then the rubber really hit the road. The root of his objections were not scientific. The root was ideological. How can we fix this thing without destroying the economy? Doesn't it mean that we need more government regulations so the government's going to start telling us how much water we can use when we shower and what type of car we can or can't not drive? And that was where we've had the most fruitful conversations, and we still have those conversations today. But today, the other day, I heard him texting his friend. And he was lecturing his friend about climate change. He said, don't you know that the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world are the very ones most affected by a changing climate? And in addition to being a linguist, my husband is a pastor, and his friend was a pastor. So he's saying, as Christians, we have to care about the poorest and those who are suffering in the world today. And that's why we should care about climate change. What type of political ideology have you swallowed that makes you blind your eyes to these facts? I have to say my favorite thing in the world is when somebody goes for me, and if you know me, you know people go for me every day on social media, on Facebook, sometimes in email. I even get some written letters. Occasionally I walk down the hall to my office and I see somebody kind of walking around with this look in their eye, and I'm like, oop, I think I have to go the other way. But my favorite thing is when somebody goes for me in front of my husband, because I just sit back and he just digs right in. But I honestly believe that I learned so much more from him than he learned from me. Because he showed me how to put yourself in someone else's shoes. How to understand that people already have values, and that in fact just about every single person on this planet already has the values they need to care about a changing climate. They just haven't connected the dots. And the most important thing that each one of us can do about climate change is talk about it. If you ask people across the US, do you ever have a conversation about climate change? 2/3 of people say never. So if we never talk about it, why would we care about it? If we don't care about it, why would we vote about it? If we don't vote about it, why would we ever fix it? It all begins with a conversation today. But that conversation has to begin with what we share most in common. Too often we tend to begin conversations on what divides us the most. Uncle Joe, how can you say that? You know that's not true. But if we begin a conversation instead from a place of respect, focusing first of all on what unites us, what we truly agree on, what we share, from there we can walk together connecting the dots to why the exact person I already am is the perfect person to care about a changing climate. If you don't know where that place is, then don't have a conversation about climate change yet. Have a conversation and get to know them. What makes them tick? What do they love? What are their passions? What are their fears and their concerns? And then when you find something, that's when the conversation can begin. So I feel that the greatest lesson that I have learned in my entire career of having thousands of conversations with people all across the US and beyond is the very first lesson that I learned from my husband. And that is that we already have the values we need to care. And by recognizing that in each other and by respecting who each other is, we can have the types of constructive conversations that we need to help us all move forward together. Because in reality, don't we really want the same things when it comes down to it? Don't we really want a better world, not a worse one? Don't we really want energy that's abundant for everyone, an economy that's healthy, resources that are available to the rich and the poor? Clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, enough food to eat, a safe and happy and healthy planet to live on? That's what we all want. I was speaking to the Royal Astronomer of England last year, and Stephen Hawking had just said before he died that, maybe we'll have to terraform Mars so we can move there to escape from climate change. So I talked to Martin Rees, and Martin Rees said, I've known Stephen for a long time. I said, well, what do you think of the idea that we should terraform Mars to escape climate change? And he said something I've never forgotten. He said, fixing climate change is a dawdle in the park compared to terraforming Mars. This is the only home we have, and we share it with every single brother and sister on this planet. What's the best thing we can do for ourselves, for our families, for every single one of us? The best thing we can do is have that conversation today. Thank you.
So my scientific and educational journey starts halfway across the world in the Horn of Africa. See, I was born and raised in Eritrea, which is a beautiful country on the Red Sea coast. It's a place of remarkable beauty and diversity of people and natural environments in every way that you can imagine. But it also happens to be in part of the world that's been rocked by conflicts for generations. So that, kind of conflicts have influenced my scientific journey. This is a reality in my part of the world because for us, we lived with wars, right? For most people, wars are what you hear about in the evening news. But pretty much all of my life's milestones are marked by wars. I was born at a time when there was an armed coup d'etat that removed the then leader. There was an active war raging to liberate Eritrea from Ethiopian occupation at that time. So even though I grew up in the capital city, away from most of the conflict that was happening in the outskirts, it was not uncommon that even for the capital city to be bombed and you have to experience these large kind of events like that. And I'm talking about the kind of bombs, that rock an entire city and leave behind vivid, very loud sounds of bombs going off somewhere, rocking an entire city, breaking windows across the region, literally, right? And bombs falling on military depots and burning, the entire establishment, leaving behind, again, those kind of vivid imageries of mushrooms of fire, clouds going into the sky. And so it was hard to escape from that kind of thinking, right, reality. But through all that turmoil, somehow found my way to science, and I give all of that credit for that to my parents, who tried their best to make sure that the wars and the political instability did not derail our education, did their best to fill the house with books, impress upon us that we have to read, we have to learn about the world around us, and did their very best for us to believe that education is the only lasting wealth in this life, and hence we kind of need to focus on that. So that kind of drove me to like school. I loved school, and hence in 1991, which just happened to be the year that Eritrea was liberated and became an independent country, I was admitted to the university, and I was one of 1,000 students that entered the university at that year, and we only had one university. So there were only 1,000 students from the entire country able to go to university. And when I got there, I took a course in Introduction to Soil Science. And I'm about 18-year-old at that time. I knew nothing about soils, really. Like most people at that age, you don't really know the science of soil, right? But then I started learning about the nature and properties of soil and the incredible ecosystem services that we derive from soil, and that the soil actually is the habitat for remarkable diversity of life and even makes our own life possible, right? And I was hooked. Started learning about soils then, and I haven't stopped since. And then somewhere along the line, I really started thinking about land degradation. And I started learning more and more about the issue of land degradation and the global crisis that this issue brings. And so when I went on for my master's studies here in the US, I decided to make that the focus of my studies. And specifically, I sought to study the land degradation issues associated with armed conflicts. And I chose landmines. And these two issues, mind you, are not necessarily always discussed together, right? When we talk about land degradation in the realm of soil science or environmental science, we're typically talking about soil erosion, or nutrient depletion, or other problems associated with agricultural intensification, deforestation, and things like that. And when you hear about armed conflicts, you're typically hearing about humanitarian crisis, right? So we never do actually discuss these things, it seems, together. But they're very related. And to me, because of my background, these are two things that I always kind of wanted to explore further, and this was a great opportunity to be able to think about them together. And so I decided that I was going to use my master's thesis for a way to understand this landmine crisis further. And I specifically tried to address a couple of really important issues. One is I really wanted to be able to identify and document the main forms, types, and impacts of landmines that actually cause land degradation. And then I wanted to develop a unifying framework that would enable us to think about how these weapons of war actually cause and perpetuate environmental degradation. And you might wonder at this point, why landmines, right? Of all things that wars involve, why landmines? And I picked landmines because landmines are incredibly common, cheap, relatively very cheap. A piece of one landmine typically costs about $3. Weapons of war, but they're extremely long-lasting, and they also happen to be weapons of mass destruction. Landmines have killed more people in the world and injured more people than chemical and nuclear weapons combined. At some point, there were about 800 people being killed by landmines every week. Another 1,200 people being injured. So this was a really global crisis that was actually affecting large members of the human community around the world. But then again, if you didn't live in those conflict zones, you didn't really know much about this problem. So through my master's research then, I sought out to study this issue. And in particular, I was able to demonstrate that the main kind of mechanism by which landmines cause land degradation is, one, by denying large number of people around the world access to their land that they actually depend for food and for their livelihood. And then every time a landmine explodes, it physically disrupts the structural stability of the soil. Add to that the fact that whether they explode or not, landmines being in the soil means that they continue to leach toxic chemicals in the form of TNT, RDX, and a range of heavy metals. All of this means that a large part of the world is inaccessible and is getting degraded. Just to give you an idea of the enormity of this problem, removing mines from just a quarter of the land that's currently affected by landmines, and assuming a very modest rate of productivity of that soil, we can produce enough food to feed 1.6 million people every year. So this is now not just a problem that is humanitarian because it kills or maims people, but denies people a right to live, a right to be able to feed themselves and their families, and it destroys the environment in the process. So, but as you can imagine, doing this work, every part of this work is completely, very, very complicated, right? One, doing field work with anything that involves these kinds of weapons is extremely dangerous. And second, nobody actually knows exactly how many mines are out there. Nobody knows where they are. Typically, when wars end and opposing militaries go home, they don't leave behind maps to lead people to where these mines are. They don't tell us how many they put in the ground, right? And these are extremely long-lasting weapons. A big portion of the current landmine crisis can be traced back to World War II and wars that happened in the 70s and since then. And add another wrinkle to this issue in that most countries around the world are signatories to international treaty that actually seeks to ban the use of landmines, including the Convention on Conventional Weapons and the International Campaign to Ban Landmines Treaty. This is such a big political advocacy issue on the global stage that the International Campaign to Ban Landmines a group of international NGOs that came together to form it, they actually won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997. But it still remains an issue, right? And another kind of really important lesson that I learned in this process is also how important it is to effectively frame your issue, right? Especially for something like this. For most people and in most political arenas, landmines are treated as a humanitarian medical crisis, right? And that's because it's extremely effective to be able to use this kind of humanitarian framework because it allows people that are so far removed from the problem to be able to empathize with the victims and hopefully be compelled to action, right? The kind of image that you all would have gotten when I started talking about landmines and their damage is probably something like head of a household being killed by mines, right? Or a kid playing in the field whose legs get blown away, and then he or she having to live the rest of their life as an amputee. Those are extremely horrifying and very, very powerful images, right? Those kind of issues and frameworks compel people to action. But you kind of, when you see it from the filter of an environmental scientist, though, as horrifying as those images are, they don't even tell the whole story, right? There's a whole other set of the problem that's not getting international recognition or the kind of attention that it deserves because we are so fixated on this humanitarian framework. And hence, we're not actually recognizing the long-term scourge that these weapons cause and the long-term suffering of communities, the natural environment getting destroyed, and societal development also that suffers because of these landmines. All of those could have been captured from an environmental framework, though, right? So as a scientist, then, when you're doing this kind of work, it's extremely frustrating, right? I have no control over the kind of political forces that shape these kind of frameworks and movement agendas. But at least doing the kind of work that I did, I found it to be consequential more than anything that I've ever done as a scientist, because at least I'm able to convey a message of how these relatively cheap, easily accessible, very widely used weapons cause very long-term environmental damage with significant consequences for societal and regional development. And I think this work remains as a somber reminder that the horrors of war are very, very long-lasting and widespread. Thank you.
So I'm a science reporter at the Washington Post. What does that mean? That means I get to spend all of my time telling the most interesting stories in the universe. When I ask questions of my sources, their faces light up because I've just given them a chance to talk about their favorite subject. And when I publish a story, people's eyes widen because they've just learned something new and fascinating about their universe. Every day, I get to feel wonder and curiosity and awe, and I get to share that feeling with other people, and I'm getting paid for it. What a racket, right? Most days, I think I have the best job in the world, but not on October 2nd, 2017. The night before, a gunman opened fire on a country music festival in Las Vegas. It is the deadliest mass shooting in recent American history. All day at work, this television monitor by my desk keeps flashing updated death counts from the shooting. 12 people, 25 people, 58 people. Part of me just wants to bury myself in the science story I'm writing about bird migration, but another part just can't tear my eyes away from the carnage on that screen. The scope of the tragedy is so devastating that the Washington Post deploys more than a dozen journalists to Las Vegas to cover it. It's all hands on deck. And so when an editor walks to my desk and asks me if I'm available to help, I say yes. I've never covered anything like this before, but I'm heartbroken and angry, and I want to do something. And as much as I love my beat, this feels like the kind of story I'm supposed to tell. I'm a journalist, and this is my chance to use that to make a difference, I think. So I arrive in Las Vegas, and my assignment is to write stories about people who were injured. And my editor tells me to go to the hospital and see if anyone there is there to visit someone who was hurt in the shooting. And I'm standing outside, watching people walk past me, and everyone looks so exhausted and stricken. And though I go up to people and ask if they want to talk to me, nobody does. One man sort of blows up at me, and he says, "Can't you just leave us alone?" After a few hours of this, I go back to my car and cry in the passenger seat, feeling really overwhelmed and really, really guilty as I replay that conversation with that man in my head. It hadn't been 36 hours since the worst moment of his life, and now this total stranger wants to ask a bunch of personal and probing questions about what happened. It just feels wrong. Most of the time when I ask my sources questions, that's how I show them that I care about them as people. But this man's message is perfectly clear. If I really cared about him, I would let him be. By the end of the day, I still haven't found anyone who wants to talk to me. And I go back to my hotel room and call my friend Jessica, who is one of the best journalists I know. And I tell her, I can't do this. I can't bring these people comfort or solace or help. All I'm doing here is making their pain worse. Maybe I shouldn't be here. Maybe I should go back to DC, back to this kinds of science stories I usually cover. Those stories are important, I do believe that, but they feel like lower stakes. All of the life or death questions about dinosaurs were answered 66 million years ago. And nothing I do could cause a black hole to feel grief. But Jessica doesn't buy it. She tells me, "You're there to bear witness. Not everyone is going to be ready to talk about what happened, but if even one person does want to, then it's your job to listen. That's what you are. That's what it means to be a journalist." I'm not totally convinced. It feels like she's talking about someone else, someone wiser and more experienced and accomplished than I am. But her pep talk gives me just enough courage to keep trying. I try to imagine that by bearing witness, I can make some meaning out of all this senselessness. So the next day, not able to bring myself to go back to the hospital, I try a church where I meet a pastor who tells me about some members of her congregation who were there for the shooting. And then she introduces me to this young veteran who ran towards the shooting to help, even as other people were running away. And then he introduces me to Paige Melanson. She was at the music festival with her sister and their mom, Rosemary. The tickets had actually been a Mother's Day gift from the two girls. But Rosemary was shot in the chest, and now she's at the hospital, unconscious. They don't know if she's going to be okay. It turns out that the Melansons are the people that Jessica had told me about, the ones who needed to talk and just wanted someone to listen. I end up spending all day at their house, playing with their dogs and hearing their stories. Paige tells me about how her mom makes the best sausage and sauerkraut. I don't know where to stand. Rosemary's husband, Steve, tells me about visiting his wife at the hospital and seeing her in her bed and wanting to just lie down next to her and hold her. But he can't because Rosemary is too fragile to be touched. I wind up writing a story about all of the things I saw in their house, all of that pain and love. And it goes on the front page, which is a pretty big deal for me. It doesn't happen very often when you write about black holes. But the best feedback of all is from Rosemary's sister, who tells me the story made her cry. So I go back to DC, and I keep in touch with the Melansons. I text with Steve every so often, partly because I know that my editors are interested in follow-up stories about survivors, but mostly because I just need to know that they're okay. But the updates are devastating. The bullet that hit Rosemary punctured her stomach, and it's making it almost impossible for her to eat. 5 months after the shooting, she is one of the last survivors still in the hospital. So I convinced my editor to let me go back to Las Vegas to spend more time with Steve and Paige and Rosemary. And when I get there, it feels like their lives are just as difficult as they were when I first met them. More so now because barely anyone is still paying attention. I show up on Steve's doorstep and he invites me in and he says, "Nobody understands what this is like. Paige has nightmares and can't be in large crowds. Steve hasn't slept in his own bed in 5 months because he spends every night in the hospital with Rosemary. He has to sleep in this really uncomfortable chair in her hospital room. And Rosemary is still in constant pain. Despite all that, they are some of the kindest people I've ever met. Steve teases me about my terrible favorite baseball team and asks about my family. Rosemary gives me a hug from her hospital bed. And they are unfailingly dedicated to one another. Someone is with Rosemary almost every minute of every day. When I finally have to say goodbye to Steve again, it's impossible not to tear up. And he gives me a hug and he tells me, "Now you start to understand." But when I get back to DC, I have a really hard time living with some of the stories I heard. I feel anxious and I cry a lot, not really knowing why. And I feel guilty again for leaving Steve and Rosemary and Paige. I feel like I wish I could do for them what I would do for my friends in that situation. Bake them a casserole, volunteer to walk their dogs. I wish I knew that my presence meant as much to them as I usually know when I talk to a scientist and I get to see their faces light up. But the rules of journalism don't allow that. I'm supposed to maintain a certain emotional distance from the stories I'm covering. I'm not supposed to get so wrapped up in people's lives that I can't be objective. And I'm definitely not supposed to do anything that would change the story I'm trying to tell. My job, like Jessica said, is just to bear witness, even though that really doesn't feel like enough. Again, I wonder if I'm able to do what my job asks of me. Eventually, I settle into my old routine. I write about dinosaurs and black holes and exoplanets. And then one day in July, I get a news alert about a very small, very important subatomic particle called a neutrino. Neutrinos are so tiny that they slip through most matter. If you hold out your hand, tens of thousands of them will pass through it, completely unnoticed every minute. But this fact actually makes them really valuable tools for understanding things that happen in the dark corners of the cosmos. If we can capture them, we can learn all kinds of new things about the universe. The neutrino in this experiment that I'm writing about left its galaxy 4 billion years ago, when Earth was just a newborn. For us to detect it, eons of evolution had to happen. Intelligent primates had to evolve, that's us. And then we had to know what neutrinos are, and we had to decide to go down to Antarctica and spend a decade digging into the ice to build a detector capable of capturing this one little particle. Listening to the scientists describe it, I say, wow, that is one lucky neutrino that it got caught. And to my surprise, he laughs at me and he says, the neutrino isn't lucky, we are. And for reasons that maybe only make sense in my own nerdy head, that makes me think of the Melancons. I think about how lucky I was to have met these wonderful people, and how sad I would have been if their story had slipped through unnoticed. I think about everything that I witnessed in their house, all that heartache and hardship, but also courage and compassion and hope. And I think about that moment when Steve hugged me goodbye, and he said, "Now you start to understand." And I think that something meaningful did come out of it. A few weeks after my second story about the Melancons comes out, Steve texts me to say that a reader of the Washington Post paid to have a recliner made for him and shipped to Rosemary's hospital so that he would have somewhere to sleep when he stays with her. When Rosemary finally came home from the hospital this October, He gave the chair to her, and now she sits in it all the time. I'm still figuring out what it means to be a good person and a good journalist and a good science journalist. But thinking about the neutrino and the Melansons has helped me think about my job a little bit differently. Both stories remind me that change takes understanding, and understanding takes showing up, having patience, bearing witness. Storytelling, like science, is how we make meaning out of what we see. I don't know if it always makes a difference in the world, but it's made the difference to me.
So that is our show. But before we go, we have so many lovely people to thank.
Yes. First, we would love to thank the amazing staff here at the Carnegie Institute for Science who have given us this beautiful venue.
Yes.
Speaking of the cosmos, I
know.
mean, gosh.
Yeah, so thank them all.
Thank you.
We want to thank Lauren, our photographer, and one of my AGU colleagues.
For doing double duty. Ian, who is working on making sure that the audio and essence is perfectly captured for
Yes.
people who couldn't be in the room tonight.
Of course. We want to thank all of you for being here, because without you, none of this happens. So thank all of you for being here.
Thank you also to our amazing partners at AGU.
Of course. Thank you.
Without whom
me.
this also... Yeah, thank you, Shane.
No, seriously, thank you so much to my colleagues, to my bosses, and all of that for making this happen.
Yeah, and for your belief that what we do at Story Collider is awesome and amazing as we think it is.
Yeah.
And also, another round of applause for our storytellers, because holy cow.
Thank you all so much for being here, and enjoy the rest of your evening.